Sarah Martinez stepped off the transport bus at Naval Base Coronado, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder and determination etched across her face. The salty Pacific breeze carried the sounds of military life, shouted orders, running footsteps, and the distant rumble of helicopters overhead. At 22, she was one of the few women assigned to support operations at this elite training facility, home to some of the Navy's most prestigious Special Forces units. The assignment had come as a surprise. Fresh from completing her military occupational specialty training as a logistics coordinator, Sarah expected to be stationed at a conventional base. Instead, she found herself at the epicenter of Navy SEAL training operations, where the most elite warriors in the world honed their skills. Her job would be managing supply chains and coordinating meal services for various training units, crucial work that kept operations running smoothly. As she made her way to the administrative building, Sarah noticed the intense atmosphere that permeated the base. Groups of trainees moved with purpose, their faces bearing the telltale signs of exhaustion and determination that came with SEAL training. Instructors barked commands across training yards, and the sound of physical training echoed from every direction. This was a world where weakness had no place, and everyone was expected to perform at their absolute best. The commanding officer who briefed her was straightforward about the challenges ahead. "Martinez," he said, looking up from her file, "you're going to be working in an environment where respect is earned, not given. These men have been through hell to get here, and they don't have time for anyone who can't pull their weight. Do your job well, stay professional, and you'll do fine." Sarah nodded, understanding the underlying message. She would need to prove herself in a male-dominated environment where her competence would be constantly evaluated. She had faced similar challenges before and was confident in her abilities, but she also knew that this assignment would test her in ways she hadn't yet experienced. Her first week passed without incident. Sarah threw herself into her work, learning the complex logistics of feeding and supplying multiple training units with varying schedules and requirements. She arrived early each morning and stayed late, determined to master every aspect of her responsibilities. Her attention to detail and work ethic began to earn grudging respect from her colleagues. The Chow Hall became her primary domain. This massive dining facility served hundreds of personnel daily, from basic trainees to seasoned instructors. Sarah coordinated with kitchen staff, managed inventory, and ensured that meal services ran smoothly even during the most demanding training periods. It was challenging work that required split-second timing and flawless execution. During her second week, Sarah began to notice the dynamics among the various groups that used the facility. The SEAL trainees formed tight-knit units, supporting each other through the grueling demands of their program. Instructors maintained professional distance while pushing their students to their absolute limits. Support staff like herself worked tirelessly behind the scenes to keep everything functioning. Among the trainees, Sarah observed a group of about 15 men who seemed different from the others. They moved with a swagger that suggested they believed they owned the place. Their leader appeared to be a tall, muscular recruit named Thompson, who had apparently been a college athlete before enlisting. Thompson had gathered around him others who shared his attitude of entitlement and superiority. At first, their behavior seemed like typical military bravado. They were louder than necessary, made comments about other trainees, and generally acted as if the rules applied differently to them. Sarah paid little attention, focusing instead on her duties and maintaining the professional demeanor that had served her well throughout her military career. The first sign of trouble came during lunch service on a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah was coordinating meal distribution when Thompson's group entered the chow hall. They moved through the line, making crude jokes and comments loud enough for everyone to hear. When they reached the serving station where Sarah was working, Thompson looked her up and down with obvious intent. Well, he said with a smirk, "looks like they've got us some decent scenery around here now." His companions laughed, and Sarah felt the attention of the entire dining area shift toward their interaction. She maintained her composure, focusing on her work and hoping the moment would pass. But Thompson wasn't finished. "Hey, sweetheart," he continued, "why don't you make sure my tray gets the best portions? I'll make it worth your while." The suggestion was clear, and his friends erupted in laughter. Sarah looked him directly in the eye, her voice steady and professional. I treat all personnel equally, she replied. Please move through the line. Thompson's smile faltered slightly at her firm response, but he took his tray and moved on, muttering something under his breath that caused his group to laugh again. The incident left Sarah unsettled, but she convinced herself it was an isolated occurrence. She had dealt with inappropriate behavior before and knew how to handle herself. However, over the next few days, Thompson's group began to make their presence known whenever she was working. They would time their meals to coincide with her shifts, making comments and creating an atmosphere of tension that other personnel couldn't help but notice. The harassment escalated gradually. What started as crude comments evolved into more aggressive behavior. Thompson began positioning himself where he could watch Sarah work, making her feel constantly observed and evaluated. His friends would join him, creating a circle of unwelcome attention that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Sarah tried different strategies to manage the situation. She adjusted her schedule, hoping to avoid the group during peak meal times. She focused intensely on her work, refusing to give them the reaction they seemed to be seeking. She maintained her professional demeanor even when their comments became more explicit and their behavior more threatening. The situation reached a breaking point during the following week. Sarah was working the evening meal service, coordinating with kitchen staff to ensure the dinner rush proceeded smoothly. The Chow hall was packed with personnel from various units, creating the usual controlled chaos of military mealtime. Thompson's group entered later than usual, when most other personnel had already been served. This timing meant that Sarah and the reduced evening staff were handling the final service period with fewer people around. Thompson approached the serving line with his usual swagger, but this time his demeanor was more aggressive than before. Look who's still here, he announced to his companions. Our favorite little supply clerk, working so hard to take care of everyone. He moved closer to the serving station than necessary, deliberately invading Sarah's personal space. You know, Martinez, we've been talking about you. Wondering what you're really doing here among all these warriors. Sarah continued serving meals, determined not to let him see that his behavior was affecting her. But Thompson wasn't satisfied with being ignored. He began making increasingly inappropriate comments about her appearance and speculating loudly about her personal life. His friends joined in, creating a chorus of harassment that echoed through the dining area. I bet she'd be more fun outside of that uniform, one of them suggested, causing the group to erupt in laughter. Maybe we should invite her to show us around base sometime, another added. The implications were clear, and Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the situation escalated beyond simple verbal harassment. Other personnel in the Chow hall began to notice the commotion. Some looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but, in the military hierarchy, intervening in someone else's situation could be complicated. The unspoken rule was often to mind your own business unless directly asked for help. Thompson seemed to sense that he had an audience and played to it. He moved even closer to Sarah, now standing directly beside the serving station where she was working. Come on, Martinez, he said in a voice just loud enough for his friends to hear, don't be so unfriendly. We're all on the same team here. When Sarah continued to ignore him, Thompson's demeanor shifted. The playful harassment took on a darker edge, and he moved to block her path as she tried to move between serving stations. I'm talking to you, he said, his voice now carrying an unmistakable threat. The least you could do is be polite. Sarah found herself trapped between the serving counter and Thompson's imposing figure. His friends had positioned themselves around the area, effectively surrounding her workstation. The few remaining personnel in the dining area seemed to sense the tension but weren't sure how to respond to what they were witnessing. Please step back, Sarah said firmly, her training kicking in as she tried to de-escalate the situation. I need to complete the evening service. But Thompson only smiled, clearly enjoying the power dynamic he had created. What's the matter? He asked, feigning innocence. We're just trying to be friendly. Maybe you think you're too good for us regular folks? He gestured to his companions, who nodded in agreement and moved slightly closer. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Sarah realized that Thompson and his group had deliberately waited until the Chow hall was nearly empty to make their move. They had planned this confrontation, timing it for maximum impact while minimizing the chance of intervention from authority figures. As Thompson continued his verbal assault, Sarah noticed that the kitchen staff had retreated to the back areas, either oblivious to what was happening or deliberately avoiding involvement. She was essentially alone with the group of hostile recruits, trapped in her work area with no clear path of escape. Thompson reached out as if to touch her arm, crossing a line from verbal harassment to physical intimidation. "Come on, Martinez," he said, his voice now openly menacing. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We just want to get to know you better." Sarah pulled back, but found herself pressed against the serving counter with nowhere to go. Thompson's friends had completely surrounded the area now, creating a wall of hostile faces and threatening body language. The situation had evolved from harassment to something far more dangerous, and Sarah realized she was in real trouble. The Chow hall, usually filled with the sounds of conversation and activity, had fallen eerily quiet except for the threatening voices of Thompson's group. The few remaining personnel seemed frozen, unsure whether to intervene in what appeared to be a military matter between personnel of different ranks and units. Just as Thompson reached out again, this time with clear intent to physically grab Sarah, the sound of boots on the floor echoed through the dining area. The rhythm was different from the casual footsteps of individual personnel. This was the synchronized movement of a unit moving together with purpose. Thompson hesitated, his hand stopping in mid-reach as he turned toward the source of the sound. His confidence wavered slightly as he realized that their carefully planned isolation of Sarah might not be as complete as they had believed. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the low murmur of voices speaking in the calm, controlled tones that marked professional military personnel. Whatever was approaching the Chow hall was organized, purposeful, and moving with the kind of precision that suggested serious business. Sarah felt a surge of hope as she realized that help might be arriving, but she also knew that the next few moments would be crucial in determining how this dangerous situation would resolve. Thompson and his group were committed now, having gone too far to simply back down without consequences. The sound of approaching personnel grew closer, and Thompson's group began to shift uncomfortably, their bravado wavering as they realized their actions might have witnesses they hadn't anticipated. The carefully orchestrated harassment was about to face a very different kind of opposition than they had planned for. As the footsteps reached the entrance to the Chow hall, Sarah held her breath, knowing that whatever happened next would determine not just her immediate safety, but potentially the entire trajectory of her military career. The confrontation she had tried so hard to avoid was about to reach its climax, and the outcome would depend on forces beyond her control. The entrance to the Chow hall filled with shadows as 30 figures materialized in the doorway. They moved with the fluid precision of a single organism, each step calculated and purposeful. These weren't ordinary recruits or even standard military personnel. Their bearing, their silence, and the way they carried themselves marked them as something entirely different. Navy SEALs who had already earned their tridents and were conducting advanced training exercises. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Rodriguez led the group, his weathered face bearing the scars and lines that came from years of combat operations. Behind him followed 29 other operators, each one a veteran of multiple deployments and countless dangerous missions. They had just completed a grueling 24-hour training exercise that had pushed them to their physical and mental limits, and they were looking forward to their first real meal in over a day. As they entered the dining area, Rodriguez immediately assessed the situation with the trained eye of a special operations professional. The body language of the group surrounding Sarah was unmistakably threatening. Thompson and his companions had positioned themselves in a classic intimidation formation, using their size and numbers to trap someone who clearly didn't want their attention. Rodriguez had seen enough combat situations to recognize predatory behavior when he encountered it. The way Thompson loomed over Sarah, the positioning of his friends, and the obvious distress of their target all painted a clear picture of harassment that had escalated beyond acceptable boundaries. This wasn't military discipline or training, this was abuse of power by people who should have known better. The SEAL team spread out naturally as they entered the Chow hall, their movement appearing casual but actually following tactical principles that allowed them to observe and control the entire space. Years of training and operational experience had made these actions automatic, and they positioned themselves to have clear sightlines and freedom of movement without appearing to do so deliberately. Thompson, still focused on intimidating Sarah, didn't immediately notice the change in atmosphere. He was too caught up in his display of dominance to realize that the balance of power in the room had shifted dramatically. His friends, however, began to sense that something was different. The quality of silence in the Chow hall had changed from the uncomfortable quiet of witnesses afraid to act to something far more ominous. "Maybe we should finish this conversation later," one of Thompson's companions suggested nervously, finally, noticing the imposing figures who had filled the dining area. But Thompson was too committed to his course of action to back down now. He had gone too far to simply walk away, and his ego wouldn't allow him to appear weak in front of his followers. Rodriguez moved closer to the serving area, his approach deliberate but non-threatening. He had dealt with similar situations before and knew that escalating to violence would only create more problems. However, he also knew that allowing harassment to continue unchallenged would send the wrong message about what kind of behavior was acceptable within military ranks. "Is there a problem here?" Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of leadership in extreme situations. The question was directed at no one in particular, but everyone in the area understood that he was addressing the situation as a whole rather than taking sides. Thompson turned to face the SEAL commander, his posture automatically straightening in response to the obvious authority figure. For the first time since beginning his harassment campaign, he found himself facing someone whose presence commanded immediate respect. Rodriguez was not particularly tall or physically imposing, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had faced real danger and emerged stronger. "No problem, sir," Thompson replied, trying to inject confidence into his voice. "Just having a friendly conversation with our logistics coordinator here." He gestured toward Sarah as if she were a willing participant in their interaction, but his body language betrayed his awareness that the situation had changed dramatically. Rodriguez looked at Sarah, noting her obvious distress and the way she had been cornered against the serving counter. Her professionalism was evident even in this difficult situation. She maintained her composure and dignity despite the clear harassment she had been enduring. The contrast between her behavior and that of her harassers told Rodriguez everything he needed to know about what had been happening. "Martinez," Rodriguez said, addressing Sarah directly, "are these personnel interfering with your duties?" The question was formal and professional, giving her an official opening to report what had been happening without making her appear to be seeking help or protection. Sarah straightened, grateful for the opportunity to address a senior leader who clearly understood the situation. "Sir, I was attempting to complete evening meal service when these recruits began preventing me from moving freely in my work area," she replied. Her response was factual and professional, avoiding emotional language while clearly indicating that Thompson's group had been creating problems. The other SEALs had positioned themselves throughout the Chow hall, creating an obvious presence without making overt threats. Their mere existence in the space changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Thompson's numerical advantage over Sarah had evaporated, replaced by a situation where his group was dramatically outnumbered by vastly more experienced and capable personnel. Rodriguez nodded at Sarah's response and turned his attention back to Thompson. "Recruit," he said, using the formal address that emphasized the vast difference in their military experience, "explain to me why you're preventing a fellow service member from performing her assigned duties." Thompson found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't honestly explain his actions without admitting to harassment, but he also couldn't simply walk away without appearing weak in front of his followers and the assembled SEALs. His earlier confidence evaporated as he realized that his behavior looked exactly as problematic as it actually was. "We were just trying to be friendly, sir," Thompson replied lamely. "Maybe we got a little carried away, but we didn't mean any harm." It was a weak excuse, and everyone in the room knew it. The attempt to downplay his actions only made them appear more deliberate and calculated. Rodriguez studied Thompson for a long moment, his expression unreadable. In combat situations, he had learned to assess threats quickly and accurately, and he could see that Thompson represented a different kind of danger than enemy combatants. This was someone who used position and peer pressure to intimidate those he perceived as vulnerable. Being friendly, Rodriguez repeated slowly, doesn't typically involve surrounding someone and preventing them from doing their job. He gestured toward the formation Thompson's group had created around Sarah's work area. "This looks more like harassment to me." The word harassment hung in the air like a physical presence. In the military, accusations of harassment carried serious consequences, potentially including removal from training programs, formal disciplinary action, and negative impacts on future career prospects. Thompson and his friends suddenly understood that this situation could have far-reaching implications beyond the immediate confrontation. One of the SEALs, Senior Chief Petty Officer Williams, moved closer to the group. Williams had served in special operations for over 15 years and had seen countless examples of how unchecked harassment could poison unit cohesion and effectiveness. His presence added another layer of authority to the situation. "You know," Williams said conversationally, "in all my years in the teams, I've learned that how someone treats support personnel says everything about their character. The people who keep us fed, supplied, and organized are just as important to mission success as the operators themselves." His words carried the weight of experience and wisdom that came from actual combat operations. Unlike Thompson's group, Williams and his fellow SEALs had relied on logistics personnel in life and death situations. They understood the critical importance of the work Sarah was doing and had genuine respect for those who performed it competently. Thompson tried to salvage the situation. "Sir, we understand that. We weren't trying to disrespect anyone. Maybe we just got a little too enthusiastic." But his explanation rang hollow, particularly given the obvious fear and discomfort Sarah had displayed during their confrontation. Rodriguez exchanged glances with Williams and several other team members. Without speaking, they had communicated their assessment of the situation and their plan for addressing it. Years of working together in high-stress environments had given them an almost telepathic ability to coordinate their actions. "Here's what's going to happen," Rodriguez announced. "You're going to apologize to Petty Officer Martinez for interfering with her duties. Then, you're going to return to your quarters and think carefully about whether this kind of behavior reflects the standards we expect from future naval personnel." The instruction was delivered in a tone that made clear it wasn't a suggestion or request. Thompson and his group found themselves facing not just a senior officer, but 30 elite warriors who had positioned themselves strategically throughout the space. The implication was obvious: compliance wasn't optional. Thompson looked around the room, seeing calm, professional faces that nonetheless conveyed absolute determination. These weren't people who made empty threats or issued orders they weren't prepared to enforce. His earlier bravado completely disappeared as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Yes, sir," Thompson said quietly. He turned toward Sarah, his previous swagger replaced by obvious discomfort. "Martinez, I apologize for getting in your way. We'll let you get back to work." It was hardly a sincere apology, but it was an acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a commitment to change his behavior. Sarah nodded professionally, accepting the apology without emotion. She understood that this was likely the best resolution she could expect under the circumstances. Rodriguez wasn't finished. "I want to be very clear about something," he continued, addressing Thompson's entire group. "Petty Officer Martinez is performing critical duties that support training operations for some of the Navy's most important programs. Any interference with her work is interference with military operations." The elevation of Sarah's role from simple logistics support to critical operational function was deliberate and important. Rodriguez was making clear that harassment of support personnel would be treated as seriously as interference with combat operations themselves. Furthermore, Rodriguez added, "The way you treat fellow service members reflects on your fitness for the responsibilities you're training to accept. If you can't conduct yourselves professionally with colleagues, how can you be trusted with the serious duties you're preparing for?" Williams stepped forward to add his perspective. "In special operations, we depend on people like Martinez to keep us alive and mission-ready. Someone who can't respect that relationship doesn't belong in this community." The message was unmistakable. Thompson and his group weren't just being disciplined for their immediate behavior, they were being evaluated for their fitness to continue in their training program. The incident would likely be reported through proper channels, potentially affecting their future military careers. Thompson's companions shifted nervously, realizing that their participation in the harassment could have consequences they hadn't anticipated. What had started as juvenile behavior had escalated into a serious military discipline issue with potential long-term implications. Rodriguez looked directly at each member of Thompson's group, ensuring that his next words were clearly understood by everyone involved. I don't want to see or hear about any further issues involving any of you and Petty Officer Martinez or any other support personnel. Is that understood? Yes, sir, came the unanimous response, though the enthusiasm varied considerably among the group members. Some appeared genuinely chastened by the intervention, while others seemed mainly concerned about the potential consequences for their careers. Good, Rodriguez replied. Now return to your quarters and think about whether your behavior today reflects the kind of personnel the Navy needs in positions of responsibility. Thompson and his group file out of the Chow Hall, their earlier swagger completely absent. The contrast between their entrance and exit was stark. They had arrived as predators believing they controlled the situation, and they left as chastened recruits who had learned a painful lesson about the consequences of abusing power. As the last of the troublemakers disappeared, the atmosphere in the Chow Hall began to return to normal. The SEAL team maintained their positions for several moments, ensuring that Thompson's group had actually departed and wouldn't return to continue their harassment. Rodriguez approached Sarah, who was attempting to resume her duties despite the obvious emotional toll of the confrontation. Martinez, he said gently, are you all right? Do you need a few minutes to collect yourself? Sarah looked up at the SEAL commander, her professional composure intact but gratitude evident in her eyes. I'm fine, sir. Thank you for intervening. I can complete the evening service. Rodriguez studied her for a moment, noting her determination to continue with her duties despite what she had just experienced. It was exactly the kind of resilience and professionalism he expected from military personnel, and it reinforced his conviction that Thompson's group had been completely in the wrong. You handled that situation well, Rodriguez told her. Maintaining your professionalism under pressure shows the kind of character the Navy values. It was a simple statement, but, coming from an elite operator with years of combat experience, it carried significant weight. Williams joined them at the serving counter. You know, he said to Sarah, we've been through a lot of training exercises, and good logistics support can make or break an operation. We appreciate what you do to keep things running smoothly. The acknowledgement from these elite warriors meant more to Sarah than they could know. She had been struggling to find her place in this demanding environment, and their recognition of her value provided validation that went beyond the immediate situation. As the SEAL team finally moved through the serving line to get their long-awaited meal, Sarah found herself surrounded by 30 of the military's most elite personnel, all of whom treated her with the respect and professionalism she deserved. The contrast with her earlier treatment couldn't have been more stark. The evening concluded with normal meal service, but the events had established new dynamics that would influence everything that followed. Word of the confrontation would inevitably spread throughout the base, carrying with it clear messages about acceptable behavior and the consequences of harassment. For Sarah, the intervention had provided not just immediate relief from a dangerous situation, but also allies who understood and valued her contribution to military operations. The experience would strengthen her confidence and resolve as she continued her service in this challenging environment. For Thompson and his group, the consequences were just beginning. The aftermath word of the Chow Hall incident spread through Naval Base Coronado with the speed that military gossip always travels. By the following morning, personnel throughout the facility had heard various versions of what had transpired between Thompson's group and Sarah Martinez, with the intervention of the SEAL team becoming the subject of intense discussion in every corner of the base. The reaction to the story varied dramatically depending on who was telling it and who was listening. Among the support staff and junior personnel, Sarah's professionalism under pressure and the SEAL's intervention were viewed as examples of how the military should function when its values were properly upheld. These personnel had often experienced similar harassment themselves and appreciated seeing it addressed decisively by senior leaders. However, not everyone viewed the incident in the same light. Some personnel, particularly those who identified with Thompson's group, saw the intervention as an overreaction to what they characterized as harmless male behavior. These individuals spread alternative versions of the story that downplayed the harassment and portrayed Thompson as the victim of overzealous enforcement by officers looking to make examples. Captain Jennifer Hayes, the base's commanding officer,
received a full report on the incident within hours of its occurrence.
Hayes had built her career on maintaining the highest standards of military discipline while fostering an environment where all personnel could perform their duties effectively. The harassment of a junior logistics specialist by training recruits represented exactly the kind of behavior she was determined to prevent.
Hayes called Rodriguez into her office the morning after the incident to get his first-hand account.
She had worked with the SEAL commander on previous occasions and trusted his judgment, but she also needed to ensure that the situation had been handled appropriately and that proper procedures were followed. "Marcus," she said as Rodriguez entered her office, "I need you to walk me through exactly what you observed yesterday evening and how your team responded." She gestured for him to take a seat across from her desk, creating an atmosphere of professional consultation rather than interrogation. Rodriguez provided a detailed account of the situation, from his team's arrival at the Chow Hall through Thompson's group's departure. He emphasized Sarah's professionalism throughout the confrontation and the clear evidence that the harassment had escalated beyond verbal abuse into physical intimidation. The recruit Thompson had positioned himself and his companions to prevent Martinez from performing her duties, Rodriguez explained. "It was a textbook intimidation scenario, and I believe it would have escalated further if we hadn't intervened when we did." Hayes listened carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions about specific details. Her primary concerns were ensuring that proper procedures had been followed and that the incident was documented appropriately for potential disciplinary action.
"How did Martinez handle herself during the confrontation?" Hayes asked.
She was particularly interested in Sarah's response because it would influence how the base command addressed both the immediate situation and any longer-term implications. "She maintained her professionalism throughout," Rodriguez replied. "Even when surrounded and clearly intimidated, she continued trying to perform her duties and responded to my questions in a clear, factual manner. She didn't escalate the situation or make demands for special treatment."
Hayes nodded, making additional notes.
Sarah's behavior during the crisis would be crucial in determining appropriate follow-up actions and demonstrating to other personnel that professional conduct was expected even under difficult circumstances.
"What's your assessment of Thompson and his group?" Hayes continued. "Do you believe this was an isolated incident or part of a pattern of behavior?" Rodriguez considered the question carefully.
His years of experience had taught him to distinguish between momentary lapses in judgment and deeper character flaws that indicated ongoing problems. "Based on their coordination and the timing of their actions, I believe this was planned harassment rather than spontaneous behavior," he said. "They deliberately waited until the Chow Hall was nearly empty and positioned themselves to isolate Martinez.
That suggests premeditation and awareness that their actions were inappropriate." Hayes found Rodriguez's assessment particularly troubling. Spontaneous inappropriate behavior, while unacceptable, could sometimes be addressed through additional training and supervision.
Planned harassment indicated deeper problems that might require more serious intervention. Meanwhile, Thompson and his companions were discovering that their actions had consequences beyond the immediate embarrassment of being confronted by the SEAL team. Their training instructors had been briefed on the incident and were now scrutinizing their performance and behavior with increased attention.
Chief Petty Officer Anderson, Thompson's primary instructor, called the group into a private meeting the following afternoon.
Anderson had served in various capacities throughout his 20-year career and had seen how character flaws that seemed minor in training environments could become catastrophic problems in operational situations. "Gentlemen," Anderson began, his tone leaving no doubt about his mood, "I've received a detailed report about your conduct in the Chow Hall yesterday evening.
I want to hear your explanation for what happened."
Thompson attempted to provide his version of events, downplaying the harassment and characterizing the situation as a misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion.
His companions nodded in agreement, trying to present a unified front that might minimize their individual responsibility.
Anderson listened without interruption, but his expression made clear that he wasn't convinced by their explanation. When Thompson finished speaking, the instructor looked at each member of the group individually before responding.
"Let me tell you something about the military," Anderson said. "Your success doesn't just depend on your physical abilities or technical skills. It depends on your character and your ability to work effectively with everyone around you." That includes support personnel, fellow service members, and civilian contractors. He gestured toward the window, which overlooked the base's training areas. Out there in operational environments, your life might depend on a logistics specialist like Martinez. If she doesn't trust you because you've treated her with disrespect, how effectively do you think she's going to support your mission? The question highlighted an aspect of the situation that Thompson's group hadn't considered. Their harassment of Sarah wasn't just a personal conduct issue, it was a potential operational security problem that could affect mission effectiveness in real-world situations. Anderson continued his lecture, drawing on examples from his own operational experience to illustrate how trust and mutual respect were essential components of military effectiveness. He described situations where support personnel had gone above and beyond their duties to ensure mission success, and other cases where poor relationships had contributed to operational failures. The SEALs who intervened yesterday understand something you apparently don't, Anderson explained. Every person wearing a uniform is part of the same team, working toward the same goals. When you harass or intimidate someone like Martinez, you're not just being unprofessional, you're weakening the entire organization. The instructor's words carried weight because they came from genuine operational experience rather than theoretical training scenarios. Anderson had seen firsthand how interpersonal dynamics could affect mission outcomes, and his examples resonated even with personnel who might have dismissed more abstract discussions of military values. Thompson and his group were also discovering that their reputation on base had been permanently altered by the incident. Personnel who had previously treated them as normal training recruits now viewed them with suspicion and disapproval. The social dynamics that governed base life had shifted against them, creating ongoing consequences that extended far beyond any formal disciplinary action. In the Chow hall, Sarah noticed the difference immediately. Personnel who had previously been neutral or indifferent in their interactions with her now went out of their way to be supportive and professional. Many seemed determined to demonstrate that Thompson's behavior didn't represent the attitudes of the broader military community. Senior Chief Williams made a point of stopping by Sarah's workstation during lunch service, engaging in brief professional conversations that served to reinforce her standing within the base community. Other SEAL team members followed his example, creating a visible demonstration of respect that helped counteract any lingering effects of the harassment. "How are things going, Martinez?" Williams asked during one such visit. "Any problems we should know about?" "Everything's running smoothly, Senior Chief," Sarah replied. "I appreciate you checking in." The brief exchange served multiple purposes. It showed other personnel that Sarah had ongoing support from senior leaders, and it provided an opportunity for her to report any continuing problems if they occurred. Williams nodded and moved on, but the message had been delivered clearly to everyone who witnessed the interaction. Sarah wasn't an isolated target without allies, she was a valued member of the military community with the explicit support of some of its most respected personnel. The formal investigation into the incident proceeded through proper military channels, with Captain Hayes ensuring that all procedures were followed meticulously. Statements were taken from witnesses, documentation was reviewed, and the facts were assembled into a comprehensive report that would determine what disciplinary actions might be appropriate. Sarah was interviewed by the base's investigating officer, providing her account of events in detail. She maintained her professional demeanor throughout the process, focusing on facts rather than emotions and avoiding any appearance of seeking special treatment or consideration. "Did you feel physically threatened by the recruit's behavior?" the investigating officer asked. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "When they surrounded my work area and prevented me from moving freely, and when the primary individual appeared ready to make physical contact despite my requests that he step back, I believed the situation was escalating beyond verbal harassment." Her testimony was consistent with the observations of other witnesses and the assessment provided by Rodriguez and his team. The investigation found clear evidence that harassment had occurred and that it had escalated to the level of physical intimidation. Thompson's group faced individual interviews as part of the same process. Their attempts to minimize their behavior and characterize the incident as a misunderstanding were undermined by the consistency of witness statements and the obvious premeditation demonstrated by their coordination and timing. The investigation also revealed that this wasn't Thompson's first incident involving inappropriate behavior toward female personnel.
While previous incidents hadn't been formally reported, multiple personnel provided statements indicating a pattern of behavior that raised serious questions about his fitness for continued military service. As the formal process continued, the daily routines of base life gradually returned to normal. Sarah continued her logistics duties with renewed confidence, supported by the knowledge that her professionalism had been recognized and that she had allies among the base's leadership. The SEAL team completed their advanced training cycle and prepared for their next deployment, but their intervention had created lasting effects that extended far beyond the immediate situation. They had demonstrated the values and standards that define professional military service, providing an example that would influence base culture for months and years to come. Thompson and his companions found themselves increasingly isolated within the training community. Their instructors maintained closer supervision of their activities, their fellow trainees viewed them with suspicion, and their prospects for successfully completing their program grew increasingly uncertain. The incident had become a defining moment that would shape the remainder of their military careers. For some of Thompson's companions, it served as a wake-up call that prompted genuine reflection on their behavior and values. For others, including Thompson himself, it marked the beginning of a downward spiral that would ultimately lead to their departure from military service. Captain Hayes reviewed the investigation findings with her senior staff, considering the appropriate balance between discipline and education in addressing the situation. The goal was not just to punish wrongdoing, but to reinforce the standards that would prevent similar incidents in the future. "This kind of behavior has no place in our military," Hayes announced during a senior staff meeting. "We need to ensure that every person serving under our command understands that harassment of any kind will be addressed swiftly and seriously." The captain's words would soon be translated into policy changes and training modifications designed to prevent similar incidents and create a more professional environment for all personnel. The harassment of Sarah Martinez had become a catalyst for broader improvements in base culture and discipline. As the formal processes continued to unfold, the real-world consequences of that evening in the Chow Hall were becoming clear to everyone involved. Actions had consequences, character mattered, and the military's stated values were more than just words on paper when they were upheld by leaders who understood their importance. The story was far from over, but the fundamental dynamics had been established. Professional behavior would be rewarded and supported, while harassment and intimidation would face serious consequences. The 30 SEALs who had risen behind Sarah in her moment of need had done more than resolve an immediate crisis, they had reinforced the values that made military service meaningful and honorable. The formal disciplinary proceedings concluded 3 weeks after the Chow Hall incident, with Captain Hayes announcing the results to the base community through official channels. Thompson received a formal reprimand and was removed from his current training program, with a recommendation that he be reassigned to duties that didn't involve potential leadership responsibilities. His military career would continue, but with significant limitations on advancement opportunities. Several members of Thompson's group faced lesser disciplinary actions, ranging from formal counseling to temporary restrictions on base privileges. The variations in punishment reflected their different levels of involvement and their responses during the investigation process. Those who had shown genuine remorse and understanding of their misconduct received more lenient treatment than those who had attempted to deflect responsibility. 2 members of the group, including Thompson himself, were ultimately discharged from military service when subsequent incidents demonstrated that they had not learned from their experience. Their inability to adapt to military standards of conduct led to administrative actions that ended their careers before they had really begun. For Sarah Martinez, the weeks following the incident brought unexpected opportunities for professional growth and recognition. Captain Hayes personally reviewed her performance record and was impressed by both her technical competence and her handling of the harassment situation. The captain recommended Sarah for accelerated advancement and additional training opportunities that would expand her career prospects significantly. Martinez, Captain Hayes said during a private meeting, "Your professionalism under pressure demonstrates exactly the kind of character we need in our senior non-commissioned officers. I'm recommending you for the Advanced Logistics Management course that starts next quarter." The recommendation represented a significant career advancement opportunity that typically required several years of additional service to earn. Sarah's handling of the harassment situation had paradoxically accelerated her career by demonstrating qualities that the Navy valued highly in its leaders. Rodriguez and his SEAL team completed their training cycle and departed for their next operational assignment, but their intervention had created lasting changes in base culture that extended far beyond their physical presence. The incident had become a teaching example used in leadership training throughout the facility, demonstrating how senior personnel should respond when they witness harassment or abuse. The story spread beyond Naval Base Coronado as well, becoming part of unofficial military folklore that reinforced important lessons about character and leadership. In training facilities, operational units, and military academies around the world, the account of 30 SEALs rising behind a harassed logistics specialist became a powerful example of how military values should be lived rather than just recited. Williams, the senior chief who had supported Rodriguez's intervention, used the incident in his own leadership development sessions with junior SEAL personnel. He emphasized how their response had reinforced the team mentality that was essential to special operations success. When we intervened that night, Williams explained to a group of new SEAL candidates, we weren't just helping one person. We were reinforcing the values that hold our entire community together. In combat, we depend on everyone around us, not just other SEALs. If we don't protect and respect our support personnel, we weaken the entire organization. His lessons resonated with the candidates, who understood that their elite status carried responsibilities as well as privileges. The incident had demonstrated that being a SEAL meant more than individual capabilities, it meant upholding standards that strengthened the entire military community. Sarah's daily work experience transformed dramatically in the weeks and months following the incident. Personnel throughout the base went out of their way to demonstrate respect and professionalism in their interactions with her, creating an environment where she could focus entirely on performing her duties at the highest level. The Chow Hall, which had briefly become a place of fear and intimidation, was now one of the most positive working environments on base. Sarah's colleagues in the logistics department had rallied around her, and the kitchen staff had developed a protective attitude that ensured she never felt vulnerable while performing her duties. More importantly, Sarah discovered that her experience had given her a voice in discussions about base culture and personnel policies. Captain Hayes began including her in meetings about support services and personnel welfare, recognizing that her perspective as someone who had experienced harassment could provide valuable insights into prevention and response strategies. Martinez, the captain said during one such meeting, "You've seen both the problem and how it should be addressed. What recommendations would you make for preventing similar situations in the future?" Sarah's response was thoughtful and comprehensive, drawing on her experience to suggest practical measures that could identify potential problems before they escalated into serious incidents. Her recommendations included enhanced training for new arrivals, clearer reporting procedures for harassment, and regular check-ins with personnel who might be vulnerable to mistreatment. Many of her suggestions were incorporated into new base policies that improved the environment for all personnel. The harassment she had endured became the catalyst for systematic improvements that prevented similar incidents and created a more professional atmosphere throughout the facility. The ripple effects of the incident extended to Thompson's former associates as well, though their responses varied dramatically. Some used the experience as motivation for genuine self-reflection and improvement, recognizing that their behavior had been unacceptable and working to develop better character and judgment. Recruit Johnson, one of Thompson's former followers, approached Sarah directly several months after the incident to offer a sincere apology for his participation in the harassment. His apology was genuine and reflected real understanding of how his actions had affected her. Martinez, Johnson said during a chance encounter at the base exchange, "I wanted to tell you how sorry I am about what happened in the Chow Hall. I know my apology doesn't change anything, but I needed you to know that I understand how wrong we were." Sarah accepted his apology graciously, recognizing that it took courage for him to approach her directly and acknowledge his mistakes. Johnson's willingness to take personal responsibility, even months after the fact, demonstrated the kind of character development that made military service meaningful. Other members of Thompson's former group took different paths. Some continued to blame external factors for their problems, insisting that they had been treated unfairly by an overzealous command structure. These individuals generally struggled with their remaining military obligations and eventually left service without successfully completing their initial training programs. The contrast between those who learned from the experience and those who didn't became a powerful example of how character development worked in military environments. Personal growth required honest self-assessment and willingness to change, qualities that couldn't be imposed from outside but had to come from individual commitment to improvement. Rodriguez returned to base 9 months later as part of a training rotation and made a point of checking on Sarah's progress. He was pleased to learn about her advancement opportunities and the positive changes in base culture that had resulted from their intervention.
"Martinez," he said during their brief conversation, "I'm glad to see you're doing well.
You handled a difficult situation with real professionalism, and it's good to see that being recognized appropriately." Sarah thanked him for his role in resolving the harassment, but Rodriguez deflected credit to his team and emphasized that intervening had been the only appropriate response to what they had witnessed. "Any leader worth the title would have done the same thing," Rodriguez replied. "The fact that you continued performing your duties under pressure showed the kind of character we need throughout the military.
We just made sure you had the opportunity to demonstrate it."
The conversation highlighted how the incident had evolved from a crisis into a positive example of military values in action. What had begun as harassment and intimidation had become a demonstration of how the military community should protect and support all its members. Captain Hayes used the anniversary of the incident to address the entire base community about the lessons learned and the improvements that had been implemented. Her speech emphasized that preventing harassment required ongoing vigilance and commitment from everyone in the military community. "1 year ago," Hayes announced, "we faced a situation that tested our values and our commitment to treating all personnel with dignity and respect. The response from our SEAL team and the professionalism shown by Petty Officer Martinez demonstrated what our military can be at its best." She continued by outlining the policy changes that had been implemented and the measurable improvements in base culture that had resulted. Harassment reports had decreased significantly, personnel satisfaction surveys showed marked improvement, and the base had become a model for other facilities seeking to improve their own environments. "But our work isn't finished," Hayes concluded. "Maintaining a professional, respectful environment requires constant effort from everyone. Each of you has a role in upholding the standards that make military service honorable and meaningful." Sarah, now wearing the chevrons of a promoted petty officer, listened to the captain's speech with pride and satisfaction. Her experience had been difficult and frightening, but it had ultimately contributed to positive changes that would benefit countless future personnel. The Chow Hall where the confrontation had occurred was now home to a small plaque recognizing the importance of mutual respect and professional conduct in military service. The inscription read simply, "Professional excellence requires professional conduct," but everyone who worked in the facility understood the deeper meaning behind those words. As Sarah continued her military career, she carried with her the knowledge that standing up for what was right, even in difficult circumstances, could make a real difference. Her experience had taught her that individual courage, combined with support from principled leaders, could overcome harassment and create positive change. The 30 SEALs who had risen behind her that evening had demonstrated that military leadership meant more than tactical expertise or physical courage. True leadership meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves and upholding values even when it would be easier to look the other way. Years later, as Sarah advanced through the ranks and took on leadership responsibilities of her own, she would remember the lessons of that evening in the Chow Hall. She would ensure that personnel under her command understood that harassment had no place in professional military service, and she would intervene decisively when she witnessed misconduct. The incident that had begun with intimidation and fear had become a foundation for a career built on integrity and service. Thompson's attempt to diminish and control had instead empowered someone who would spend her career lifting others and strengthening the military community. The story of the recruits who trapped a logistics specialist in the Chow Hall, only to face 30 elite SEALs who rose behind her, became more than just an account of harassment resolved. It became a testament to the power of principled leadership and the importance of protecting the values that made military service meaningful.
In the end, the true victory wasn't just Sarah's survival of the harassment or Thompson's punishment.
The real triumph was the transformation of a crisis into an opportunity for positive change that would benefit generations of future military personnel who would serve in an environment shaped by the courage and character of those who had stood up when it mattered most.